What's up guys? So let's hop right into it. How do we double, quadruple, or even quintuple our DPS in the game? And on top of that, get your survivability double, quadrupled as well. So starting right off, there's a lot of things to understand with Diablo, and certain characters can benefit off of stats that others can't. Let me give you a quick example. So for example, the sorcerers can use barriers, the barbarian can use damage reduction while fortified. Well, some of these can overlap, and there are certain special items like the Temerity Pants that can grant yourself barrier on, let's say, the rogue. Some of them can overlap, some of them won't overlap, so just keep that in mind. I'm going to mainly be covering the rogue for the example, but these stats will apply across more characters, as in you want cooldown reduction in your helmet in almost every single situation. There are going to be niche examples where some of these may not apply, but in terms of getting your damage up as high as possible, there's something called damage buckets, and this is one thing you have to learn if you really want to min-max and get your damage to insane numbers. Another thing I want to go ahead and start off with the introduction in this video is mentioning that this damage number here, this attack power, does not actually really matter. The armor and the life may not matter as much as you may think. And to go ahead and kind of explain, let me go and just play a quick little clip. Certain aspects in Diablo, this is just like high level Diablo play, if you understand the mechanics of maybe knockdown, stun, freeze, these are all defensive stats, right? Where if the enemy isn't going to be able to react, I'm going to be able to survive. This is a very frequently asked question. How come I'm able to dive in these packs of elites when I'm like 10 levels under what the enemy is? And it comes down to the enemies getting stunned, dazed, knocked down, if I'm playing sorceress, even frozen. These are stats that you can't measure in the stat sheet, so don't always look at that as the best stat. But I've been playing Diablo for a really long time, so there's certain mechanics where it does become a skill issue, but most of the time it's because you want to be able to min-max and get the stats that your character can benefit off of more than another stat, even if it has the same numerical stat. To go over an example, and this applies to damage, getting the X% damage, which can be found on very popular boots called the Penitent Greaves, where it says we get to deal, in the blue, 10% X more damage to chilled enemies. That is not the same as getting the plus damage versus chilled enemies. If we got damage versus chilled enemies, that's not an X. That is the biggest difference in terms of the damage. Like, as in getting the 10% here is more valuable perhaps than getting a 20% in just damage versus chilled enemies. That is the huge difference between getting your damage to go way high, because you have all these different multipliers. A good example would be doing any sort of snapshotting with applying vulnerability. There's a lot of different examples of this, but I just want to go over every single piece of gear, because this is going to make it a lot easier to understand versus just giving you guys numerical stats, and it makes it a little bit more interesting, and it will really help you gear up to be the best of the best. So starting right off, again, there's other characters that can benefit off of certain stats than others, but this will apply to all classes, okay? And there may be a certain niche build, maybe it doesn't play crit, sure. But if we're talking about getting the most min-maxing for 99% of players, okay, they're going to be running crit in their build for the most part. Again, I know there's certain exceptions where you may not want attack speed, but for the most part, this is going to apply to most players. So now that we got the intro out of the way, let's go over every single piece of gear and what you want to look for on these said pieces of gear. Again, it depends on your build, but for the most part, these are going to be accurate. So starting right off, for the helmet, what stats are we looking for to really min-max in terms of survivability and damage? So the most important stat actually on the helmet is going to be that cooldown reduction. On top of that, getting life. Those are the two main stats that you're looking for. Now, there's another main stat, like in our case, it's dexterity for the rogue, but on the sorceress, you want intelligence. On the barbarian, you want to have strength. Now, what does this stat actually do? Well, dexterity is really good because it's a separate damage bucket, but every single class in the game will have their main stat also apply to a defensive category. So, barbarian will get armor, and it will get the increased damage based off of getting more strength. Where the rogue, you can see it just increases the armor and it just gives us energy regeneration, which is something completely different than if I was to play a bard. So keep in mind, not every class will need to get the same their main stat does something different, is essentially the main thing that you want to look for. So if you're playing sorceress, yes, you want intelligence for the most part. Resistance is a little bit worse. In fact, resistance is so bad in Diablo 4 in the current iteration, it really does need a buff, and I'm guessing it may get a buff in the future. I'm not going to cover it in this video, but to sum it up, basically, as you go higher in the world tiers, you get diminishing returns on your resistances, on top of the resistances already getting diminishing returns as you put more points into it. So you really want to focus in on getting damage reduction from close and far, or just flat damage reduction. So in the helmet piece over here, Again, cooldown reduction in life, and then your class's main stat. So that could be, for Barbarian, it would be Strength. Now, for the classes that would run Intelligence, it might not be as important because their defensive stat isn't as strong. Armor and Dodge are going to be superior to the Resistances because I kind of briefly explained Resistances is kind of a bad stat. Now, I do like to have maximum energy because it gives me a bigger threshold so I can activate my abilities. A lot of different classes, they'll have some sort of regeneration on rings, and this is going to upkeep your DPS. So it's true DPS versus just cosmetic DPS. So the best way I can explain this is, sure, a Grizzly Rage Werebear Druid can hit for 1,000,000 damage, right? But how often are they hitting for 1,000,000 damage versus their energy getting regenerated? How long does it take to build up that Grizzly Rage and getting all of the stacks, all of the stuff that is required to get this big damage hit, right? Versus someone consistently hitting for 100,000 and is like maybe 3 or 4 times faster and can consistently output it. So getting yourself some sort of resource so you don't have to use your generator is usually what you want to do in the far end game builds. A lot of far in game builds will not use a generator because they're going to be able to get real DPS versus fake DPS, which is like cosmetic DPS, because you hit harder and you can screenshot and put it on your refrigerator and share with your mom. But in reality, the DPS that you deal is going to be tied to how much time you can use your big damage dealer, which in our case, let's say Twisting Blades or Whirlwind or Ice Shards for, let's say, Sorceress, right? You want to make sure you're able to do that damage versus doing your low damage to get your energy up. So I really like having energy. It's quite a nice stat in most characters. There's always, it could be Fury or Barbarian, but you get the point, right? And as far as like the aspects, we'll briefly cover them because it depends on the class you're playing. Eventually, you may want to drop your basic skill anyways, but I have a video that goes over all of the best aspects too for like most builds. But I like to have the main stat, specifically dexterity, and then energy. Now, if you're playing a class that can benefit off of having another skill point, you can get bonus skill points on like your boots, you can get it on your helm as well. But for this build in particular, I don't need it, so I like having the energy or dexterity. But the two important stats, cooldown and your life. Now, just as a heads up, in terms of building your items, right? So in terms of crafting, usually what happens is you're going to get some sort of item to drop. And let's use this. This is an excellent example. So let's say we get this ring as a drop. It's got damage versus chilled, frozen. Okay, let's say I'm playing Ice Shards, which is a very popular meta build. Then it's got fire damage, and then we have like lightning crit strike damage. Well, I can't really use fire and lightning, and this is kind of playing a cold. Maybe I'm playing a hybrid build, but for the sake of the video, let's say we're just playing something that is reliant on specifically like cold damage, freeze damage. So like these two stats are worthless. This is almost a worthless ring. So let's say instead of the lightning crit, it was just flat crit strike chance. Now I have 3 out of the 4 stats being viable. Now I could take this to the cultist, and again, let's say I'm just running some sort of cold build. So the fire damage is essentially useless, but it doesn't make the ring useless. What we would do is then we would craft on top of it. So we would enchant it at the occultist and roll off the fire damage to something we can use. Earlier on in terms of your progression to get the most min-maxing out of your damage is really trying to just get an item that has all of the stats that you can use. Maybe I apply vulnerability. This is like super common with, let's say, the Ice Nova, right? Where you freeze everything. Okay, there we go. We can apply vulnerable damage, and now we have an item that has all of the stats. Now, to try to get them to be perfect on every single stat is very, very rare. I mean, you're talking about like 1 in like 1,000,000 for a lot of these cases, especially earlier on. So just get an item that has all stats that you can actually use versus getting an item that, let's say, has a higher item power, depending on the slot. Now, in weapons, item power is a lot more important than item power, let's say, on a ring. Again, this is at least getting 725 as the threshold. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the next piece of gear, since I kind of like went off on a tangent over here about getting things that you can actually use for your character. And again, it depends on your class. Next up, in terms of the armor here. So most of the time for most builds, you want damage reduction from distance and you want damage reduction from close enemies, and then getting life. This is massive. Getting that huge massive, look at this like legendary like power, right? Our basic skills grant 20% damage reduction. That's like a legendary power. This is just rolled on a chest piece over here. So this is going to increase your survivability by a long shot. You can also just get flat damage reduction. The flat damage reduction usually gives you half value, but that is still good. If you got that as a roll, any variants of these, again, there are some builds that want to benefit off of having some sort of like skills to something, or getting anything that would be damage to, let's say, like plus to physical damage, let's say, or fire damage. You can get those on offensive stats, but those offensive stats are not the X multiplier, so they are very, very bad. As in 10% like physical damage, I can go to the Paragon board, put 2 points in on a 5% and get the same value, but I can't just put in 2 Paragon points at the very end of the game to get, 23 damage reduction from close enemies. That doesn't doesn't exist. So the values that you're putting in need to be min-max, and this is the best way to do it. You can see getting damage reduction is just very, very valuable at the end of the day. That's what you want to try to roll on your armor. So getting some sort of damage reduction. Armor is actually so much better than resistances. I mean, everyone's playing for the gems, really quick to go over the gems. Depending on your class, the topazes and the rubies on the rogue are going to be excellent. I've seen some sorceresses use barrier one, but you can increase your life, which then increases your threshold on barrier percent anyways. But for the most part, in terms of gems, we'll talk more about that in a second, but basically it comes down to skulls in every single piece of gear, and then rubies or topazes. I personally prefer rubies. Some people prefer topazes. It depends on your build. It depends if you get any benefit off of having more HP. But nonetheless, in your chest piece, that's what we're kind of looking for. So damage reduction as well as getting maximal life. Maximal life is one of the best stats in the entire game. It's something you do not want to skip out on. As far as the gloves, this is our offensive piece of gear. This is where you get a lot of your damage. So most builds, crit, strike, chance. You want your attack speed, and then some builds can benefit off of lucky hit. This is where there's like one stat that's kind of up in the air. So ideally, crit, strike chance, attack speed, and then, oh, by the way, if you come from PoE, attack speed is cast speed. It's the same thing. But then on specifically the gloves, most of them will have a core skill. So let's say we are playing like the sorceress, right? On the gloves, we would want something that would be like ice, ranks to ice shards. If it drops +3 to ice shards, if we upgrade it to 5 out of 5, that will give us that +4. So if you get an item that drops as a +3, actually, I don't know if we can input it here. If we put this to 3, even if it's a 5 out of 5, it will then go to 3. So it'll start off as lower. So if it's a non-upgrade, it should be saying like 2. Basically, you want to drop as 3, and then you want to upgrade it to 5 out of 5, which will convert that 3rd rank into the 4th rank of the ice shard. So on our gloves, we're going to be wanting to get that rank of whatever skill that you're using for your damage. Now, it could be different for the build because you may not use a core skill. There's certain builds like the sorceress, you can use like firewall, which is not considered a core skill, but you get the idea, which will roll in a different category, just as a heads up. And then for us, I'm playing a trap build, so I want trap cooldown reduction. You can also get cooldown reduction, but it's more niche. It's not like you can't get global cooldown reduction on your gloves. It's just like niche area. You can also get lucky hit on your build as well. It depends on what build you're playing, to be honest, but the last one where it says trap cooldown, that can be kind of anything. It's kind of dependent on your build, but for the most part, the 3 stats, those are the main ones that you want. And then for the pants, you want, again, damage reduction close, far, and then you can go for main stat if you want to, and then maximum life. I really like to have maximum life. Temerity or other great options. I think temerity is still really good. I know some people don't like it because it doesn't, the bonus barrier doesn't go with your like actual like numerical stat HP. It's like your base HP. But I think that temerity is still one of the best in slot. So if you get that, that's a great thing to have as well. The penitent greaves are relatively easy to drop. I've dropped a lot of these, but these are pretty much the best boots in the entire game. For most builds, there's like, I know there's one with sorcerers where you get like extra like crit based off like your movement speed or something like that. But for the most part, these are going to be good for most builds. We're talking min-maxing. Ideally, these always roll with movement speed. You want high movement speed one. But the reason why it's so powerful is it applies chill. Chill will then crowd control all of the enemies. So damage to chilled, slowed, crowd control. You get all of those benefits off of rolls. Now, I opt to, in my build, I went for min-maxing. So you're going to see in a moment here, we're asking for a lot. But these boots in particular help out so much with any build because you can get bonus to damage to chilled enemies, bonus damage to slowed enemies, or crowd control enemies. That makes gearing up your weapons so much better, and it's going to increase your DPS because it's a 10x multiplier, 10%. That doesn't make your damage 10 times, but it will multiply everything times that percent value. It's like, it's so good to get this because again, that X meaning that it's multiplicative is huge. So next up over here, in terms of our item. So you always want to imprint whatever power that you have that's like your main source of damage, whether it's like your whirlwind or whatever your big damage dealer is, if it has an aspect, you want to put it on your two-handed weapon. And the reason why is it doubles the stats. So what stats are we really looking for? So you always want to, if you're playing rogue, by the way, it's always crossbow, never bow. Bow is basically, if you see a bow that drops, unless you're running like Sky Hunter or like some really weird thing with Wind Force, you always want a crossbow. The reason why is there's an implicit on the weapon, meaning that this is always going to give me, crossbows will always drop with the implicit of, what I mean by implicit, by the way, is that top line where after it says damage per second, you go under, and the vulnerable damage, the first vulnerable, the 60%, that will always roll there. If you get a bow is damage to distant enemies, which will not always be applied, right? Because sometimes an enemy jumps onto you, they teleport, you're going to deal less damage to those enemies because they're up in front of your face. Whereas the vulnerable damage, that's going to be up 100% of the time. So certain things will be more valuable than others depending on the class. Like for example, with a lot of sorceress builds, if you do lucky hit, well, you definitely want to run a wand, and then you can get cooldown reduction on your offhand, which is superior, potentially, depending on the build. But again, you want vulnerable damage on your weapon. This is kind of what you're looking for. You're looking for vulnerable damage, crit strike damage, core skill damage. If you are using core skill, again, Firewall Sorceress and some other builds may benefit off of another. You can get like damage versus burning, right? And then you want a main stat. Again, dexterity is one where you would definitely want it, or armor, which would apply to strength, which would be very good. But if you're doing willpower or if you're doing intelligence, you can actually get a different stat because those values are not as good. But again, always craft your special power on your two-handed. So that's kind of what we're looking for. Since we're in weapons, I'm going to do the other side of the weapons. In terms of swords versus daggers, this is kind of a thing, and it depends on the class that you're playing to, you know, which one is better. I personally prefer swords at the late stages of the game, but in the earlier stages, getting damage to close enemies, which is the implicit on daggers, where you see where it says crit strike, that's going to be more valuable because in the damage buckets, all of that damage to, let's say, close enemies, that damage is grouped in like the massive bucket. So it gets less value than what we would get if we just get crit strike damage, if that makes any sense, because you want all of the buckets to at least be not only touched, but you want all of the buckets to kind of have relatively higher numbers versus just one being way high and the rest super low. You'll get way more damage because it multiplies everything at the very end. So you get more value out of that. Now, I'm also getting crit strike damage because I highly value crit, and once you're at like 80 to 90 crit, which you can actually achieve quite easily on the road, because the rings we're going to be getting crit as well. But in terms of the things that you're looking for, now this one I have damage to close enemies and this other one I have core skill damage. Well, what's better? The difference in numbers, like the core skill is 23 or 29.3, right? Where the other roll is 35.3. So we get more value out of getting damage to close enemies. Well, which one is actually better? Like, no doubt, vulnerable crit strike damage is going to be like your go-tos on the offensive in most builds, right? Or if you're playing any build that has damage to like chill, then you're always chilling the enemies, and that's kind of fine. But if you're getting like damage to like, let's say, frozen enemies, well, the boss might not be frozen at all times. Could I get damage to enemies that are affected by a trap? Sure, but I would much rather get damage to, let's say, close enemies or vulnerable, because those are going to be up more, if that makes sense. Now, in terms of difference between like the core skill damage versus close enemies, obviously that means we ought to be close. Now, some enemies, they may teleport away, and maybe we impaled them with a bunch of blades, so at that point, we're not close, we're not getting that maximum damage. What's better? I mean, it's really penny pinching for like just a small numerical stat, but in terms of the differences, you can run either. I mean, it's such a small amount of difference, but keep in mind there are differences. If you get like that small percent, if you really want to min-max, yeah, you can get damage to close enemies, but remember, if you're popping a bunch of twisting blades, and then you're dashing away, or you're using whatever skill to move out of the way, like you jump to another target with, let's say, a shadow step, you use dash, whatever the case may be, you may do less damage to those. So it kind of depends on your play style, so don't always feel like you need to copy every single streamer's build, right? But those are kind of what we're looking for on the weapons. It's pretty much, again, you don't need dexterity necessarily, but I highly value it for the defensive purposes of dodge. I think dodge is one of the most underrated things, and that also comes down and kind of answers the question, how am I able to survive? Getting massive amounts of dexterity gives you massive amounts of dodge. If you can get like 1,000 dex, which is very realistic, okay, getting 2,000 is like 20% like reduced damage, not necessarily reduced damage taken, but it's like you just don't take the damage. It's like better than damage reduction. It's crazy how good dexterity is. And if this game gets expansion packs, which we already know, if you can get a couple thousand dexterity, I mean, rogue could be insanely tanky. But nonetheless, let's go to move on to the amulet category. And I know this video is getting kind of long, so I'll try to speed it up, but there's just so much knowledge that I got to drop. So I've already mentioned resistances are pretty garbage. So what you want to try to do, okay, is tag all the resistances at least once. So you get all res with this, but if you can get like fire, cold, and then like poison, lightning, or shadow resistance, you're gonna always get 2 resistances on the implicits of rings anyways. Try to touch all of those first. I know I mentioned resistances are pretty garbage, but you do still want to touch them at least all of them once with a ring, if you can. That would be ideal. But what you're looking for on your amulet, you're looking for cooldown reduction. Also, I forgot to mention on boots, you're just kind of looking for movement speeds. I know like these are unique, so it doesn't really matter. You can also get energy reduction cost, and you can also get plus to skills of like, let's say like on sorcerers, you get it like to the shields, right? Like the frost shield and like the fire shield. But for the most part, Pentagrams are going to be the best install for most builds, and that is simply due to you being able to chill all the enemies. And I have in particular, and this is not a build guide for it, but I have like something where like you can daze the enemy. Again, this is extra survivability. It's huge to be able to daze an enemy because then they can't use their abilities, which is pretty good. It also plays days, which for my build, I get resource on crowd controlling an enemy, so it really helps me sustain my energy, which goes back to the same point of your true DPS really comes down to how many times are you spamming Twisting Blades versus how many times are you needing to spam Puncture to actually get the energy generation. Like my current build right now, we just dropped our generator, so we can fit in something else that's going to be a buff for even more damage or more mobility, so we can kill stuff even faster and get dungeons done faster, so we can get our glyphs upgraded. But anyways, going back to the amulet. So we want cooldown reduction, we want movement speed. Movement speed is actually a defensive stat that some people may not understand. Like if the enemy drops a giant like AoE on the ground, moving out of it faster will make you take less damage, and you wouldn't be able to go into like this thing where like, okay, what's my armor? Because people sometimes will ask, dude, you're killing stuff so fast, you must have insane attack power. And I do, but some things cannot be measured, right? In terms of defensive stats. So again, that's what I'm trying to give you guys that knowledge there. Anyways, next up, energy cost reduction can be big, so you're going to be able to spam your abilities more. You can also get it on your boots, and then traps cooldown reduction for me, but depending on your build, you may be able to get cooldown reduction. You can also get passives. Some of the passives, skill points can be good. You can get more skill points to certain things. This is great for that. That's what the amulet essentially does, but pretty much most builds. You would also get damage reduction on the amulet as well, but ideally, you really want that cooldown reduction and you really want that movement speed, and then pushing for energy, that's like getting like the triple stats, and then the cooldown reduction can be good for some builds. In my case, yes, it's going to be best. I already mentioned the implicits on the rings, but usually crit strike chance, crit strike damage, vulnerable damage. Vulnerable damage is like one of the better ones because it's a separate like multiplier and there's not a bunch of things that go into it, so getting that will be ideal. I like running life. I mean, if you really want to min-max in damage, you can get extra resource. Most builds will have some sort of resource. You can also get resource generation. It can be flat or it depends on your build. If you're playing a build where it's like Necromancer gets like insane amounts of extra damage on Bone Spear based off of your essence after it's like above 50, and so you may want to think about your build versus just again copying other people's stats, because you can get more damage because you're playing like a different skill and you can min-max a little bit harder. Sometimes when you look at some people's piece of gear, and this is really big, some people are asking like, why do you have like, a certain stat and item? Hey, sometimes it's literally just the best that I have at the moment, and that's why, like, for example, in one of my gameplays, I had like strength on one of my pieces of gear. There's no reason why I had strength. Some people are like, dude, is strength like good to roll on road? No, it's just because that's at the time, I didn't roll on it. It's just that at the time, that was the best thing. So don't always feel like you need to copy people's builds. I'm running this to give me, when I kill a vulnerable enemy, I get more resource. It just, again, uptime on DPS is king. And then pretty much the same thing for the other ring, crit strike chance, crit strike damage, and then I'm getting restore our primary resource when we crowd control an enemy. I could literally walk into a group because I chilled them all, and that's crowd controlling, so I just literally get free energy. Every single enemy on screen, as long as we are relatively close, because this is a pretty large AoE on the little like frost trail, right? That's what makes this so good. And when you guys have been asking, dude, how do you have like so much resource? You like never use a generator. And like I said, this is like a build that I just threw on here, but I've dropped my generator. That's how I do it, is I'm getting a lot of resource via these two rings. Usually how rings work is there's some sort of thing with resource. If you want to, you don't have to get crit strike chance, damage, vulnerable. You do want crit strike chance though, okay? Because it's the only areas that we can get it. You get it on your gloves and you get it on your rings. And so ideally, you want that crit strike chance, okay? Getting crit strike damage and vulnerable damage, those are still great stats, but if you don't have the amount of resource, you can get resource generation or maximum resource, so you can usually wait for your cooldown to come up, that pops and you get a bunch of resource. So keep that in mind as well. It doesn't have to be these exact ones, but ideally for me, in my circumstance, because once you get enough resource somewhere, you can then just roll more damage. And that will pretty much cover it for the video. I know that there's so much information with this, but again, if you're playing one thing I forgot in the video, the gems, okay? What are the best gems to min-max for like defensive stats and offensive stats? So emeralds in most cases will be the best. I know there's some builds that may use overpower, but for the most part, emeralds or sapphires, it doesn't matter. They give you the same exact value. This one is crit strike damage to vulnerable enemies, which we always apply. The difference between a sapphire is it's going to be something to do with crowd control. If I throw in like any weapon over here, if we throw in this, it gives you the exact same stats. So you can see over here, sapphire, 12% crit strike to crowd control. The other one is 12% to vulnerable. So like it depends on your build, but for the most part, yeah, it doesn't really matter too much which one you put in, but they give you the same value. So for most people, the emeralds inside the weapon, and then inside of the chest piece, rubies, or you can run topazes. And if you're playing the barbarian, you can run damage reduction while fortified, and then skulls. Again, armor is superior. It's the best thing in the entire game. And in terms of like aspects, I'm just gonna leave my video so this video isn't too long. I know that like, still like almost half an hour, but it's just too much info to drop. But this is how you min-max, and this is how you're seeing some of those streamers hit for insane amounts of damage. They're reaching all of these damage buckets, and I'll link this too because it's a very, very helpful tool to make sure that you are getting every single one of these. And what I mean by every single one of these is one in each color at least, okay? So you want vulnerable damage, you want damage from like, you know, your core skills. You don't have to hit chilled, close. You're not looking to hit every single one of these gray ones. Just one is all you need. At least one. You're going to get a bunch of the gray ones anyway, so it doesn't matter. But then you want to make sure you get crit trick chance and damage, because these kind of coexist. And then obviously getting your main stat, because that's what I've been kind of harping on. That's why a lot of times when people ask like how your damage is so high, that's why. Anyways, that's going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like on it. If you're new here, hit subscribe, turn the bell if you'd like to see more videos in the future, and I'll catch you on the next video. And also check the pinned comment for more videos.